Okay, almost there. This is a video heavy week. That's okay. You get to see lots of me. Lucky you. The last thing that we're going to do here is summarize what we've just learned and how to implement it. So we've just spent a lot of time talking about reproducibility. And just to remind you what we mean by that, what we mean if I say I want this document to be reproducible, is that I can find and organize that document. It has a good name. I understand what this document is intended to do. It means that your references to data and later down the line to code are not relative to your computer. They make sense. They work for everyone. Hopefully they use the here package. It means that making your package dependencies is very clear, that you have your library statements and I can find them. It means this principle of the code being able to regenerate the analyses if the data changes. And it means that you have organized your document well and explained your analysis process. So how do we make this happen in R Markdown, which is the specific type of document that we are using in this class? So first of all, when you start a new R Markdown document, which you are likely about to do for your lab, the first thing you want to do is deal with that front manner, that YAML section. Choose a good title, put your name as the author if you wish, put a date if you wish. The next thing you should do is save that .rmd file. And save it deliberately. Do a save as and pay attention to the folder that you are putting that file in. And make sure that you give this file a meaningful name. Stuff is not a good name. Lab 1 is an okay name. Lab 2, dplyr, hip hop, that's an even better name. When you see that file much later, when you see it pop up on your computer, you remember exactly what's going on in that file. It's nice to have the name of this RMD file somehow match the title of the file. Doesn't have to match exactly, but it's good for those to make sense with each other too. Once you've done that, your first code chunk looks like this. So when you start a new Markdown file in RStudio, it populates with some example text for you. And you don't need the example text, but I actually recommend you hanging on to that first code chunk. Because this is a very useful code chunk, and it's one that even I have not memorized. It kind of looks a little gnarly. I don't memorize how to do it. I just keep the default one that populates in RStudio. We're going to come back to this code chunk a little later. Your second code chunk should absolutely be your libraries, be your package dependencies. And I want you to state every package dependency for the entire document in this early code chunk. What I don't want to do is go partway through the document and then hit a library statement. I know you might be doing an analysis and get to a point where you need another package, and then you realize you need it, and then you type in library of that package. But take the time to actually move that library statement to the top of your document, because that means that when someone else is starting to do this work, they're not going to do part of the work and then hit a point where they're missing a package. They're going to know up front exactly what they have to install to run your code. So these are your first two code chunks, always. And then as you do the rest of the document, just make sure that it's nicely organized. Make sure that you use these hashtags in order to make the section headings and subheadings. Make sure that each code chunk is kind of a unified thought. There's not really a single right answer for what you should put in each code chunk. I suppose there's two wrong answers. You shouldn't just have one chunk for every single line of code, and you shouldn't have all of your code together in one big mega chunk. But beyond that, it's kind of subjective. I like to think of it as, what is something that I might want to run all together? Or what is one unified step in my analysis, whether it's a simple step or a complex one? It's really up to you how you divide out your code chunks, but regardless, you should make sure that you have regular text before and after it to motivate what's happening here. So I don't want to just see code and an output and no discussion in your labs in the future. I want to see something where you say, we make a scatter plot to compare the miles per gallon with the number of cylinders in a car. And then after the plot shows up, you say, and we observe from this that there is some kind of relationship between these two variables. And as you're thinking about this deliverable, I want you also to think about what should go in that final knitted document. There's sort of two flavors of R Markdown. One of them is when you're doing the analysis and you're working in that source file and you're constantly hitting play on your code and editing your code and texting it. And then there's the version of R Markdown where you're done with all that and you're using this functionality to produce a beautiful final document. So once you're done with your exploration and your crafting of your analysis, think about what you want that final document to look like. Does the reader really need to see the step where you loaded the data? Probably not. Does the reader even need to see your code? I mean, I do in these assignments because I'm grading them, but if you're writing an article, say for the internet, you don't need to show people your R code. They don't even need to know that R is what you used. That can all be happening under the hood. And in some cases, the reader doesn't even need to see the output of your code. Some of your steps of your analysis you're doing for yourself to see those results, to understand the code, or to understand the data. And these are important, but that doesn't mean that they need to be shown in that final knitted, polished document. So make good choices about what you choose to display. Using those options for the chunks, how do you display what you meant to show? Another good habit to get into is to label your code chunks. So this is not required, and actually you'll catch me out. I'm not in a good habit of this, but I'm trying to be. So notice how this code chunk here says R, and then it says data. That's right here. This is saying, here comes some R code, and then it's saying, I am labeling this chunk with the name data. And that's because this is maybe the chunk where I'm reading my data set in. And that's cool because it lets you jump between chunks in kind of a long analysis. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here we have that serials exploration R Markdown document, and you remember that all these chunks were labeled. So towards the bottom of this document, we did some dplyr verbs. And if I wanted to jump to that part of the analysis, I can actually just go straight to this little drop-down menu in the corner. And you can see that everything is nicely organized using the hashtag section headers in Markdown, and also using the labels for these chunks. And I can jump down to a chunk if I want to, just by clicking on its name. Now the other thing I want to show you is that we did have 2 summarized tasks we were asked to do here. And I gave these chunks different names. What if I'd given these chunks both the name summarize? Knit that document. Let's see what happens. We get this error when knitting, and there's a lot going on in this error, but here is the most important sentence. Duplicate chunk label summarize. Basically, R Markdown can't handle it if you have 2 chunks with the same name. So as you're getting good at chunk labels, and you're probably copy-pasting your whole code chunk, just make sure that you're always giving that thing a unique label of some kind. So hopefully this showed you that naming your code chunks can help you navigate your document a little better, and is a good habit to get into. Now don't forget that when you copy-paste a chunk, it has the same name. And so you want to update that label. You cannot have 2 chunks with the exact same label. And I'll remind you from last week that there are these chunk options that you are choosing. So this goes back to thinking deliberately about what you want to show in your final document. The ones that you'll use most often are echo, which says, do I need to see the source code? Even if it's running, even if the output is showing, do I need to see the code itself? And then there's eval, which says, do we even need to evaluate this code? Maybe you're just trying to show the source code, but you don't need all the output to show up. Include is a nice shortcut that says, don't show anything, don't show the source code, don't show the output, but it still does get run. It still does say create a new variable if that's what that code does. It just doesn't show up anywhere in your final knitted document. And then remember that we talked about how R can give back kind of helpful chatty messages. They might be warnings or errors that you need to worry about, and they might be regular messages. A warning or a message is not going to prevent your file from knitting, but it does mean that that text, that chatty message, is going to show up in the knitted file. And so if you don't want that, which you usually don't, then you can choose the chunk option that says warning equals false. It says don't talk to me about warnings in the final document. With errors, if there is an error in your code, R Markdown will not knit that code, unless you set error equals true. So error equals true means I'm okay with this code generating an error message rather than actual output. And so this is not usually something you want. You don't want a final document that has errors in it, but it's good to know for if you are working through a practice document and you can't get it to knit, but you don't know where your error is, you can say, look, let's set the error option to true. Let's let this document knit and show me the errors. And so you might ask yourself, well, woof, what if I want every single chunk to be able to show the error? Or what if I want to turn off echo so that I don't see any of my source code for all of my chunks? So this goes back to that setup chunk, that weird looking one. Here's an example of it. I've given it the label global options. And I've added a few more options in here than you usually see. And what this is going to do is this is going to make these chunk options apply to every single chunk in the document. So every figure will have a width of 6 and a height of 4. Every piece of code will show up. Warnings and messages will never show up. Now don't worry, you don't always want identical behavior for all your chunks. It's nice to have this shortcut so you don't have to remember to add it into the chunk every single time. But you can always override these, so if you have an option that you've put into the header of the individual chunk, such as right here where I have eval equals false as an option on this global chunk, those ones will take precedence. So the local one always wins, and then these options that I've set at the beginning, they're just the defaults if we don't specify something else. So I think these tricks will make you better able to create R Markdown documents that are convenient for yourself in the future, and that produce something that looks nice, is easy to read. All right, you are done for this week. Wow, you have learned the tidyverse, you have learned reproducibility, you are ready to do some actual real data analysis. I'm excited to see what you come up with on Lab 2. See you next week.